Welcome to my Music Under the Lens series. Today we will explore the Overture from the Barbiere di Siviglia by Gioacchino Rossini. Enjoy! The opera Il Barbiere di Siviglia was premiered at the Teatro Argentina in Rome on February 20, 1816. Exactly 9 days later, Rossini would turn 24. The work was titled Almaviva, ossia l'inutile precauzione, not to be confused with the other Il Barbiere di Siviglia by Giovanni Paisiello, composed and premiered a few years before. The overture genre developed in Italy and France in the 16th century. In the second half of the 17th century, opera composers used it as a piece to be placed at the beginning of an opera. The overture, therefore, is a piece which takes place before the curtain rises. In Italian opera, after the beginning of the 19th century, the overture became known as the Sinfonia. Rossini composed many overtures. Many of them became famous, such as those from Guglielmo Tell, La Gazza Ladra, and Il Barbiere di Siviglia. These pieces were written sometimes at the very last moment. For this reason, it was not so important if the material had been already used in previous works. This is just the case in this overture. Rossini had used exactly this material in two previous works of his. Aureliano in Palmira, premiered on December 26, 1813 at Teatro alla Scala in Milan, and Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra, premiered on October 4, 1815 at the Teatro San Carlo in Naples. Let's look at the instrumentation used here by Rossini. This is the first page of the critical edition edited by Alberto Zedda and published by Edizioni Ricordi. As we can see, it takes the name Sinfonia, intended as a synonym for overture. Scrolling from top to bottom, we have two flutes, two oboes, two clarinets, two bassoons, two horns, two trumpets, timpani, bass drums, first and second violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. It is an instrumentation frequently used in orchestral compositions between the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. A characteristic of this sinfonia, which always referred to it this way, it is that respects the traditional formal scheme, so-called French, which is divided into two parts, a first part relatively slow and a second part in faster tempo. This is the case here, with an andante maestoso followed by an allegro con brio. Rossini uses the term maestoso with the intention of creating an atmosphere of serenity and of great importance at the same time. Let's listen to what happens in the first two bars of this sinfonia. We can interpret what happens in these bars in a very imaginative way. The initial chord fortissimo is the solemn announcement that something is about to happen. The following short ascending repeated pianissimo notes is the orderly gathering of people at a meeting place. The two polite and elegant musical gestures, first played by the winds and then by the strings, are a response between people now meeting at that place. All of this is repeated a second time. Repetition is a process often used in musical composition. It ensures that the material, the figures, the musical gestures are better perceived and remembered by the listener through their repetition. After this moment of great solemnity, we now have a brief fragment of transition. we hear the solitary sound of an oboe, followed by a solemn walk, as if a march, from the whole string section. It is as if that lonely voice of the oboe intended to capture the attention of the audience, introducing something that will happen later. However, for Rossini, this musical idea seemed insufficient to completely capture the attention of the public. Then he decides to give to the first violins, with an expressive pianissimo dolce indication, a very elegant and relatively extended melody, which we may say completes the work the oboe began, creating the perfect climate. At the end of this andante maestoso, we find again that walk of small steps in the strings, alternating with solemn forte calls. Here too we find twice the fortissimo chord that we had heard at the beginning. With this andante, therefore, Rossini has very effectively prepared us for the Allegro con brio. Let's hear its very famous incipit. Some of the strings repeat a note in pianissimo and with precise regularity, as if it were a rigorous tick-tock. Also in pianissimo, the first violins and viola presents a theme, a rhythmical cell, shaped in such a way as to remain imprinted in our memory. In this section also, after this first theme is presented, it is repeated. I would like to point out something very important now. While we are listening to this, our imagination must be active. That is, it must be able to connect a musical figure we are listening to with characters acting on the stage in a comedy. An imaginary theater in our mind must be activated. It is important to do this, otherwise simply passive listening will lead to nothing. It will not make us understand anything and therefore will be useless. This music is not just music written for the theater, it is itself theater. So it is up to us, through active listening, to be able to imagine and see this theater. After having exposed this first theme of the Allegro con brio, Rossini suddenly changes the situation. A fortissimo makes the whole orchestra sound as if a storm made of sounds has broken out. These storms can be often heard in Rossini's works. They generate a moment of great turmoil and have a dramatic and transitional function. Here in the score, we can see the point where the storm ends. The sky clears, we return to the open air and meet a new character. This new character is the second theme of the Allegro con brio. The oboe presents it. Here too we find a section that will be repeated with different orchestration. After this second theme episode is concluded, Rossini begins a new episode with a compositional mechanism very typical of his style. It is the so-called Crescendo Rossiniano. Starting from a simple figure with a clear rhythmic shape and character, through a process of repetition, aggregation, and accumulation, the sound energy gradually grows until it reaches the point of explosion. It is a process of great effect, which produces great dynamism. It is as if the orchestra becomes a volcano which eventually erupts. All the material we have heard up to this point of the Allegro is also played a second time, as happened for smaller elements. What happens in details also happens with larger fragments. This is a rule that Rossini set for himself in order to manage organization and to give order to form. The repetition, of course, is not exactly the same. Rossini always changes something. It would be boring and predictable otherwise, and Rossini would not be Rossini. For instance, when the second theme in the Allegro appears for the second time, it is entrusted to the clarinet. In his first appearance, it was the oboe, remember. Now the clarinet pronounces the first phrases of the theme, while the second one is instead played by the bassoon. We find again for a second time the Crescendo Rossiniano we had heard before, but its function is now different. In fact, its growing energy pushes us, catapulting us into a più mosso, full of vivacity, rhythm, frenzy, and excitement. It is the grand finale of this Sinfonia of the Barbiere di Siviglia. As usual, in the box here below, I have listed some links to performances that I find very beautiful. There are so many that I obviously could not list all of them. I hope you enjoyed my video. I thank you very much, and I would like to remind you of the other videos in my Music Under the Lens series. I also invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much again, and see you soon.